Hey, all you literary legends and luminaries. I'm Julie, and welcome to another episode of Booksmart. First, let me say that Shakespeare is going to join me on this Booksmart episode. If you know, he has a big sister, Baby, who is like a 125-pound dog, and she is currently on vacation at the lake, and he is just so very sad right now. He hasn't been without her since he was a kitten. So, if you hear some ruckus or some purring in the background, that would be Shakespeare. Today's episode celebrates my favorite female writer, Sylvia Plath. It's called Loving Sylvia Plath, A Reclamation by Emily Van Duyne. While I always liked Sylvia Plath, I was one of those who liked her more as I aged, which goes against the stereotype of the Plath lover, which Van Duyne even writes about in her book. The typical Sylvia Plath fan peaks in high school and college and then grows out of her. After all, Plath doesn't live into old age. She barely makes it into middle age when she kills herself at 30 years old. I'm not a huge fan of Plath's poetry. I like it, but I don't love it all the time. Sometimes I think it's almost too abstract, heavy, and forced. But I adore all her short stories. Their autobiographical nuggets filter through her fictional stories. My favorite quote of Plath's is one from her journal, which, if you remember, I did a Booksmart episode about last year. This quote I love is this, and I even have it hanging above my laptop. My life will not be lived until there are novels and stories which relive it perpetually in time. That's what I want too as a writer. Van Duyne even mentions this particular photograph of Plath in her book. Oh, those coincidences that I talked about last week, they're always everywhere. I was always most interested in Plath's marriage to the god-awful Hughes. I never liked him. I don't care how revered he was as a poet. Because I've read so many books about Plath, I've become much more selective in what I read. I've even chosen not to read a couple of the newer biographies because even if there are new information and letters and whatnot that have been found, at this rate I feel that what we are getting is the biographer's take on who Sylvia Plath was, which I'm not always all that interested in. But Van Duyne's book looked fascinating. A book I almost didn't find because it was in the psychology section at Barnes & Noble, a decision I still can't figure out. I usually don't look through that section, but as I walked past it, there was Van Duyne's book displayed on the shelf. On the barcode, it has the category of literary criticism, yet here were half a dozen Loving Sylvia Plaths on display in the psychology section. Very baffling. The book jacket promises that Van Duyne has reconstructed the last years of Plath's life through newly available archival materials, so I bought it without question. Let me first say that the book wasn't what I expected, but let me also say that doesn't mean I didn't like it. I was expecting a more story-like structure that unraveled the last years leading up to Plath's suicide. That was not what I got at all. Before the book even starts, Van Duyne has quoted a line from Madonna's Live to Tell. A man can tell 1,000 lies. I've learned my lesson well. I'm sold already. I know what that means and where this is headed, and I'm completely on board because I don't like Ted Hughes. I know I've already said that, and I'm probably going to say it many more times before this episode is over, but I never trusted the guy. He rearranged Ariel and even took out poems and then added different ones in, ones that she wrote the last few weeks of her life that reveal her increasing depressional state. Why would he do that? And then when he criticized Plath's paintings of little hearts and flowers on the furniture, I just thought, you douchebag. And never mind the whole cheating on Sylvia, lying to her and making her seem like she was the crazy one, and then marking her gravestone as Sylvia Plath Hughes, a name she never used in her writing life. Oh, and then the whole Assia gassing herself and her daughter she shared with Hughes, his mistress. Yeah, all that story. Yeah, it always made me wonder, would Ted Hughes be canceled today if such a thing happened in our present time? Probably not. Pardon my tangent. I'll try to keep my rants about Ted Hughes to a minimum. Van Duyne's introduction confused me a bit. She spends time discussing Chanel Miller's Know My Name, a book I did a Booksmart episode on about a couple years ago, if you remember that, and I liked the book quite a bit. And the connection, though, to Plath in Van Duyne's book seems a bit weak. The whole intro is a bit jumbled, and I'm not quite sure what I'm about to read. I've lost a little bit of my Madonna Live to Tell passion, but it picks back up once the bulk of the book gets its momentum. Do not go into Loving Sylvia Plath as any sort of biography. You will get a bit perturbed. What Van Duyne attempts to do in her book is showcase what other biographers and us readers in society as a whole have gotten wrong about Sylvia Plath. And our current image of Plath is a direct effect of how Hughes portrayed her and those who idolized her. If you don't know this already, and Van Duyne writes about this as well, Hughes and his sister threatened to sue any biographer or journalist if they wrote anything Hughes found objectionable. Hughes is worse than Richard Carpenter. Van Duyne has followed the evidence, so to speak, as she traces the many biographers of Plath, not always in a well-organized fashion. I enjoyed reading about these other biographers because I've read many of the books Van Duyne discusses. Essentially, what she's getting at is that people knew from the start that Hughes was abusive. Plath even told many people this, yet the world appeared shocked when new letters were revealed just a few years ago. Sorry, my cat is about rumbling around behind there. Many accused Plath, long dead of course, and those who revealed such letters, questioning the why now as if there was some sort of sinister underlying reason to the timing. This information was always there, people, but it was ignored in the 1950s and 60s. Beating up your wife was not against the law, and Hughes was excellent at destroying the evidence. He controlled the narrative for decades. I appreciate that Van Duyne dedicates a chapter of her book to Asa Webel, the mistress of Ted Hughes that led to the separation of Plath and Hughes. Asa had a girl with Hughes, although Hughes's family dispute the parentage of Shira. When Shira is 4 years old, she gasses both herself and her daughter, the same manner of death Plath chose for herself. I read Lover of Unreason years ago, which was a fascinating read focused on Asa, especially since her existence in relation to Hughes was hidden for years. Hughes really was an ass. So listen to this. And how Hughes treats other women is very indicative of how he treats Sylvia. So in 1968, when Asa Webel Amaka translations debuted to rave reviews, Hughes sent her a letter he called Draft Constitution, outlining his expectations for her behavior should the couple try once more to make a home together. At the time, Hughes was at Court Green with Frida, Nicholas, and his aging parents, William and Edith, and Webel was living in London with Shira, the daughter she had with Hughes in 1965. In a 10-point list of directives that included rules about when she could and could not sleep, what she could and could not wear, and what she could cook for the children, Hughes tells her that she must be as German as possible, as Israeli as possible preferably, and do all you can to rid yourself of English sophistications. Much later, he mocked her accent as a Kensington jeweler's elocution in his poem Dreamers, which appeared in Birthday Letters. Can you imagine that? I mean, apparently at first sight, Hughes was some sort of mythical gigolo with some sort of sexual magnetism that women couldn't ignore. But once you get to know him, creep doesn't begin to describe his abusive behavior. What Van Duyne has done with Asa is show how the Hugheses and the men who knew both her and the Hughes, as well as biographers, have portrayed Asa as this femme fatale, the killer of men and their wives even. Nothing is farther from the truth. So let me read you this because Asa took the heat, obviously, as stuff came out about Plath's suicide. So asked by her colleague if she felt responsible for Plath's death, Webel demurred. She thought Plath's death had nothing to do with her, a line that has sometimes been held up as proof of her cavalier attitude as a femme fatale. But was she wrong? They didn't know one another well, and Plath made it a point to be vicious when she gossiped about Webel with her London friends, words that surely found their way back to Asa, affecting her feelings towards Sylvia. When we demand that Webel castigate herself for Plath's suicide, do we follow the same cultural scripts for women, expecting more compassion from her, for instance, than we do from Ted Hughes, who moved Webel, one of his lovers, into the home where his first wife died a scant month after her suicide? So, why do we hold the mistress more accountable than the cheating husband? And why did Asa get the brunt of the responsibility of Sylvia's death? And why was Hughes completely off the hook for it? Now, let me reiterate what I said on my Unabridged Journals of Sylvia Plath Booksmart episode. I'm not comfortable saying it's Hughes' fault that Plath took her life. However, I will 100% blame Hughes for what occurred in the aftermath, because that he had control over, and boy did he use it. He didn't even tell Sylvia's mother that she killed herself until later. Hughes went out of his way to conceal it, always citing his children as the reason. I doubt that was the sole reason. One of the most compelling factoids in the book is regarding Hughes' possession of Sylvia and her creative mind. And this was something that if I had read it in another book, I didn't pay all that much attention to it, or it didn't stick out as anything. So Hughes wrote this poem about the hands and how they're like one and the same, and that he and Sylvia Plath for one person was an idea not unique to that poem. Hughes spoke publicly during the marriage about the notion that he and Plath shared a brain. In the couple's 1961 interview for the BBC's Two of a Kind, Poets in Partnership, Hughes told the host, Owen Leeming, that he had access to all the experiences Sylvia had in the past. It's like two people that are sympathetic to each other. Make up one person, they make up one source of power, which you both use, and you can draw out material in incredible detail from the single shared mind. Responding to Hughes' statement that she felt the same way, Sylvia demurred. She didn't think she and Hughes shared a brain. I think perhaps I'm a little more practical about it, not quite so abstract. Hughes' declaration that he and Plath shared the same mind, body, and a fate that put circumstances beyond their control reduced her to less than adjunct to her famous husband, a condition she felt keenly in her lifetime. One would think that such a proclamation would mean Hughes would never dream of cheating on his wife, with whom he shares a brain. And remember, Plath acted as Hughes' secretary and agent. Without her, Hughes wouldn't have probably gotten as far as he did in those early days because she was the one making all the effort to get his stuff out there. And also, while he was at home writing poetry at his leisure, she was the one working to pay the bills. Just thought I'd add that in there. But anyhow, the excerpt I read is a good example of what Van Duyne has done throughout her book. She's using this kind of evidence to show what kind of husband Hughes was and that he controlled the narrative of Sylvia Plath, and that what we have been told about Plath is not the whole story. What was new evidence regarding Hughes' abuse toward Plath means we have to reconsider the image society has maintained of Hughes. Van Duyne sums it up by writing this, and I quote, "But what the Boucher letters made clear was that the image we had of Ted Hughes was at least as distorted as the one we had of Sylvia Plath." Well stated. I like that Van Duyne comes right out and states her evidence, which some might say are more accusations than fact. So many books wheedle around such information. We know that Plath and Hughes got violent with each other, and when Plath smacks back, it seems okay to report such scenes. But when it's just Hughes, biographers don't like to directly state what happened. For instance, other books have suggested that something happened between Hughes and Plath, but we don't really know what, only that during their European trip, Plath suddenly turned moody and depressed. Van Duyne uses the evidence she has tracked to state that Hughes strangled Plath on their honeymoon in Spain, and even brings up other women who have reported being strangled by Hughes. Van Duyne even discusses the language used, choke versus strangled. It's a compelling argument, and I don't doubt for a second that Hughes strangled Plath, probably multiple times. Van Duyne spends some time analyzing Plath's poetry as well. This part is always so tricky for me. Is there ever a right way to interpret a poem? And is the poet and the poem's narrator one and the same? It's tricky at times. Yes, almost everything Plath wrote was closely based on her own experiences and the people she knew. Yet sometimes such interpretations need to be known just as that, interpretations. I found many of Van Duyne's ideas fascinating, though, and her interpretations are very compelling, but I'm always a bit hesitant without the poet herself telling us what such poems mean to make a certifiable statement that this is what the poem is about, like there's some sort of answer key. Another idea Van Duyne negates is how many scholars refer to Plath as an unreliable narrator, that what she wrote, even in letters, cannot be taken literally. That's just preposterous. Yes, would Plath's perception of events change over time? Of course they would. Was she writing such letters of past abuse for a reason? Probably. I would be telling anyone who would listen, and I would not mince any words in doing so if my husband up and left me with an infant and a toddler and went off with his mistress. But that doesn't mean she's unreliable, and it doesn't make her a liar. We all are unreliable when you think about it, especially when you deal with our perspective and how that changes. And if you're going to call out Plath for being an unreliable narrator, why is Hughes not an unreliable narrator, especially regarding Plath's legacy? That's the question we should be asking. The stuff Hughes said at her funeral even, how nobody liked her and that it was either her or him, it's difficult for me to even repeat such stuff. How could he say such things, especially at a funeral? In any case, there are so many more details in the book that you'll have to read for yourself. The most troubling and profound aspect of Van Duyne's book involves Frida, Plath and Hughes' daughter. If you don't know this already, their son Nicholas killed himself when he was 47. I wish Van Duyne would have spent more time developing Frida. The author even runs into her at Plath's grave. How remarkable is that? But for me, Frida might be the most fascinating part of the story. So first, let me read to you this. Whatever we call it, the poetic marriage survived both Plath and Hughes. In 2017, their daughter Frida wrote in her brief foreword to her mother's first volume of letters that her parents were as married in death as they were in life. She explained her conviction. The reason my mother should be of interest to readers at all is due to my father, whom she credited with bringing her mother's work into the world. Historically speaking, this is a misreading of her mother's career. By the time of Plath's suicide, she had already published 2 books. But it also shows that while this poetic marriage may have outlasted death, it's saddled with the same bleak terms as its historical twin. In their daughter's reading of the life together, Hughes didn't just marry Plath, he created her. And then, let me see. So it is that on the first page of a book that encompasses more than 1,000 pages of her letters preserved by her friends and family and the collaborative work of libraries and archivists over the course of half a century. Sylvia Plath is not a writer. She is written, a corpse bride in her husband's perpetual romance. And then it goes on to say, in reality, their marriage lasted less than 7 years before Hughes blew it up and Plath killed herself. Hughes would later tell Frida that he and Plath were trying to get back together. So I've tried to put myself in Frida's position. She only knows her mother through her father, really. And I'm assuming she adored her father. Why wouldn't she? The perspective that we have of our parents is not usually who they are and certainly not who they were. And everything she knows about her mother comes from her father, and her father is a very unreliable narrator. I wish this idea was explored more in the book because this is key to Van Duyne's premise. My biggest criticism of the book is at times I don't think the book even knew what kind of book it was, in parts. No wonder Barnes & Noble didn't know where to put it. Parts read like a memoir, with Van Duyne connecting to Plath's intimate partner violence, with fragments of her own personal story of intimate partner violence. Parts of it reads like a book report that connects the author's life to text. Chanel Miller's Know My Name and Carmen Maria Machado's In the Dream House come up frequently. This stuff seems like it was completely unnecessary in relation to Sylvia Plath. Then other parts of the book read like a scholarly journal that is trying to prove intimate partner violence from Hughes to Plath. And then the rest of the book is an analysis of certain Plath poems that prove the violence that Hughes inflicted upon her. The tone of the book was even a bit jumbly at times, and I wasn't fond of that kind of writing, going from textbooky to memoir to book report. Loving Sylvia Plath would have been stronger had Van Duyne picked one path and then focused on that. But here's the thing. This book had me thinking of the bigger picture, and that bigger picture transcends Sylvia Plath. When we write about someone who can no longer speak for themselves, how much of the truth and their perspective are we really capturing? I'm writing about my mother and both my grandmothers, and I feel like a detective. As far as I know, there are no sinister secrets in their past, but the versions of them that I knew were as mother and grandmother. These women had lives long before I was born, and their lives were not solely that of mother and grandmother. My dad can only answer so many questions. Yet when I dig through letters and scraps of paper and other keepsakes, I know I'm placing significance on stuff that probably has little in reality, and then missing other aspects completely that were probably major parts of who they were. How does any researcher, writer, historian reconcile such a conundrum? If you are a researcher, a writer, a historian, you should read Loving Sylvia Plath, even if you have little interest in Plath. Van Duyne's research is a good reminder for anyone who's ever picked up a history textbook. Look at how watered down and one-dimensional we've made historical figures. We either ignore all their faults or villainize them. Complex individuals we've reduced to a caricature of who they were, and sometimes we don't even have the basic facts right. That's what Van Duyne has done with Sylvia Plath. She has shown us how we have gotten it wrong, and she is trying to make it right through her book. Ultimately, I think Sylvia Plath would be pleased with the book and all the rest that have been written about her, even if many of those previous books missed their mark. Remember my favorite quote of hers, "My life will not be lived until there are novels and stories which relive it perpetually in time." Even though Plath herself was unable to write anything more of her own life, look at all that's been written and cemented into our world about her. Over 60 years later, we're still writing books about Plath and talking about her, and people are reading those books. I'd say Van Dyne's book is one more written piece which will bring Plath to life again for her readers to relive that life perpetually in time. Thanks for watching. As always, my goal at Booksmart is to get a little bit smarter, one book at a time.